primary purpose, and I hadn't had a chance to meet him before tonight, but anybody who walks in and tells me they love me is good in my book. So, period.
And that's all you're going to do? I forgot to tell her she's supposed to give a 45-minute introduction so I can cover everything I know and get out of here. Are you all at this meeting over there, too? God, oh Friday. Joe was one of the Sunday morning speakers at the 50th anniversary in Montreal, and he said he's down here on this stage, and up there in that mass auditorium are all these people. He said he felt like he was talking to himself, and when I look over there, I kind of have a feeling I'm talking to myself, but I got some folks up here that don't, I guess you broke the habit or don't, these are pure folks up here. Well, we got a bunch of sick suckers here tonight. It got to be. Nobody in their right mind would come out in this kind of weather, would they? Well, I'm not in my right mind, and I'm here, and my name is Cliff Bishop, and I'm a real alcoholic. Also a serious and very enthusiastic member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And because of a loving God, I found through her 12 steps a loving and lovely Al-Anon wife that had enough sense to stay home tonight. The sponsor that taught me how to follow the direction that came with their steps in this book, and I asked everybody to bring their big book. How many brought their big books tonight? A few of them read the bulletin board. I'm proud of them. The rest of them, there's some laying over there you can pick up. And a whole bunch of people exactly like you, I am truly enjoying my 6,488th day of sobriety, and I, by God's love, living sober. By God. And I owe Alcoholics Anonymous far more than that time. Alcoholics Anonymous found me in September of 1964 near death. At that point, I had lost all my self-respect. My wife was getting a divorce. My daughter said, "I wish you'd die, you drunk son of a bitch." She was 14 years old and candy striping at the hospital. My son had nothing to do with me. My boss had flown in from California and fired me, and I couldn't stay sober 24 hours. Totally unemployable. And that's what I brought to Alcoholics Anonymous. Next month, Wayne and I are going to celebrate 58 years of continuous marriage because a divorce didn't go through. That daughter that hated me today thinks I'm one of the neatest guys on earth, and given her 3 fantastic grandchildren, 2 of whom look like they're going to wind up needing us. And that's one of the reasons I've become such a hard-nosed about trying to carry a single message, and we'll get into that in some depth. My son and I get along fine, haven't had a job in 14 years, so everything's working out real fine. I don't understand any part of that. And I never have the slightest idea what's going to come out of my mouth when I get up here anymore, because when you live as long as I have and been around as long as I have, there's an awful lot to talk about. And I'm never sure exactly what it's going to be. But let me tell you, I showed up in September of 64 near death and hung around till the spring of 1970. I had 2 visits back out in the liquor store, one about 90 days like we're supposed to, and the other one about 5 months. And after that, I hung around 5 years, real solid. But I wound up in a group, probably one of the very first groups in our part of the country, or certainly in Dallas, that decided they didn't need what was in this book. They were going to do it by meetings. And we had one meeting every day. The one thing we had back then, we only had 7 groups in Dallas. We had 2 dry-out places, one called Casablanca and the other one Texas Clinic. And all they were was a place to go and be medicated through a bad drunk. So if anybody wanted help, what they did was they picked up the telephone, called one of those numbers in the telephone directory, and we'd go out and pick them up and haul them in. Some of you may know Billy and Ray Kay. Billy was our secretary back at that time. And every time that phone rang and she'd look up, she'd pick out whoever was in front of her, and she'd say, "You go pick up so-and-so at such and such a place and bring them in." And I never heard anybody say no. And that's the way I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. We had a puking drunk laying around the club most of the time, and not any program. But there's nothing like a vibrating, puking, sweating, bleeding alcoholic to keep somebody from wanting to drink. It's magic, absolute magic. And the Washingtonians found out about that a century before. They like 2 things that we have in our fellowship today. They like the program, and they like the tradition. All they did was get together, have meetings, and tell their story, and as a result of that, they became very, very successful. In less than 5 years, it became over 100,000 members, scattered all over the country. But they decided they could get into things other than drinking, and so they got involved in trying to help other people. and they brought in people to try to build up the stature of the thing, to lend a little bit of class to it. In fact, a young senator from Illinois was one of the people that addressed him. His name was Abraham Lincoln. The problem was, though, that he had an agenda that he wanted to use this podium for, and so he talked about his thing called slavery. Somebody else got up here and talked about the temperance movement, the wet and dry issue. And from that, in 5 years, they were totally gone, became extinct. Today, we do not have to suffer that, but unfortunately it appears that so many in our fellowship are. I got to tell you, it's really interesting. I was gone 13 years, from fall of 70 to February of 1983. And during that period of time, there was a tremendous transition within our fellowship. Because in the 60s, we only had speaker meetings, and occasionally, somebody might talk about a problem. I remember the very first discussion meeting we had in that group. But every night was a speaker meeting. Not much recovery, but it worked. It kept us from drinking. Now, that wasn't enough for me. I had to give a little bit more. And as a result of not having enough within the fellowship, I decided I'd go back out and reestablish myself in that business world because I had been fired from a very prestigious job with one of the Fortune 100. And that bruised my ego. I've got to tell you, that hurt worse than anything that ever happened to me. And that's what caused me to get into that last drunk that got me ready to call Alcoholics Anonymous. Thing of it was, though, making meetings didn't do it. And so I decided I'm going to back out in the business world. I'm going to prove to the world that I can take care of myself. I can reestablish myself. I can become a successful businessman one more time. And I did. Did very well. The only problem of it was, after about 10 or 11 years of not being with you, 15 or 16 years after my last drunk, I'd been hunting all day over in East Texas. Beautiful day. And I got back to the motel. I was staying in Tyler. And the thought passed through my mind, wouldn't a beer taste good? Now, that's not the first time I'd heard that thought. But this is the first time the whole committee said, you betcha. And so, sitting in Tyler, dry as a bone, I drove to Kilgore, 70 miles round trip for a 6-pack of beer. I had been hospitalized 7 times to keep from dying drunk before Alcoholics Anonymous found me in the 60s, so now I begin to see the insanities, although I couldn't see a thing. And when I came back over this 13 years, we'd gone from these wonderful speaker meetings to discussion meetings, which I thought were far more interesting. Because when I got back and everybody thought how old I was and how much time I'd been away and so on, well, they wanted me to talk at every meeting. I loved it. The only problem was I didn't have a program. But back then, I don't know if you hear it around here, but I hear it in places. They say, you work your program, I'll work my program. I thought, okay, I'm a pretty intelligent guy, I can do that. So I sat around and listened to what was said in meetings. And I was doing an awful lot of traveling over in East Texas because that's where most of my business was, so I had an awful lot of tapes going all the time, and I'd listen to speakers on the tape, and I'd pick up this real jazzy stuff. And when I get into a meeting, I'd sit down and pop some of this stuff off, and then I was hip as could be. And right after the meeting, somebody'd say, Cliff, I love what you said. And I said, that stoked my fire, so I'm ready for the next meeting already. And the groups were big. The meetings were big. And then all of a sudden, I started seeing something happen. Maybe you've seen it happen where you've been. All of a sudden, people aren't showing up so much anymore. All of a sudden, the meetings are becoming smaller. Here's an example. One of the groups that folded up here just a few months ago, I'd go by and make a meeting with them once in a while because I had some good friends there. And they normally have 60, 80 people at that noon meeting. It'd been a year, maybe a year and a half since I'd been there, and I went over to a noon meeting, and along about 5 minutes till 12, there were 10 of us sitting in that meeting. And one of the founders was sitting there, and I said, what in the hell has happened here? He said, well, the treatment centers aren't sending us newcomers the way they used to. And before I could catch my mouth, the smart thing went off and said, what the hell did you do with the ones they sent you? And I thought that was a fair question. And I still think it's a fair question. What are we doing with the newcomers that we're receiving today? I picked up something here that some of you may have seen. Anybody knows anything about Clarence Snyder? One of his comments, he talk of his, he was transcribed, and I put it in print. Clarence in 1963 wrote the following, or he said the following, and it's transcribed. There have been millions and millions of alcoholics staggered across the face of this earth. They've lived and died in alcoholism. They have died and they have carried down in disgrace families, friends, and associates with them. They've caused carnage in this world and they have died hopelessly. It's been a tragedy. Out of all these millions of people, therefore, why? Till you tell me why. Just a few thousand of us have this opportunity. Why are we chosen for this? Why am I chosen for this? Why do I get this chance? Why do you get this chance when thousands and thousands and millions of others never had this chance and there never will? Ask yourself this sometimes. It might put a new value on your membership here. I run into things like this and it starts my mind thinking a little bit different direction because I know how true that is. I don't think most of us recognize how fortunate we are to be given an opportunity to come to Alcoholics Anonymous in the first place. Statistically, they say, and I happen to have been an actuary in my last profession, so facts and figures mean a great deal to me, and I was a physicist before I got into that, so basically I'm a man of science and man of numbers, and these are the things that I'm impressed with. A lot of folks aren't, and that's fine, I understand. But when I sat and take a look at the fact that less than 1 in 20 of us alcoholics are ever given an opportunity to sit in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, I began to recognize how very, very blessed I am. And then when I recognized that less than 1 in 50 of us is ever going to get 10 years sobriety, and I'm sitting here looking at 18 years, I begin to wonder, why am I so blessed? I'm sure every once in a while we've asked that question, why is he doing this to me? And today I look around and I say, why is he doing this for me? Why am I one of these so very, very blessed, so very, very fortunate? Yeah, it took me over a year after I got back to really begin to understand what this thing was about. I was hooked up with a sponsor the very first day I was back, a guy named Keith Reed. I don't know if any of you knew Keith. Keith was one of the most loving, forgiving men I've ever known in my life. Very crippled with thrombosis. But old Virgil Skaggs hooked me up with him the very first day back. And 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a Sunday morning meeting, and a guy named Paul was telling me a story. He said, my name's Paul, and I'm an alcoholic, but I don't have a drink between now and the end of the month. I'll have 15 years sobriety. And he started telling me story. And he hadn't been into that more than 10 or 15 minutes before I recognized this is the Paul that I took coffee to back in the 60s. This is the guy who couldn't stay sober. This was the guy that kept us sober because he couldn't get 30 days at a time, and here he had 15 years, so I went up and said, Paul, you owe me. I brought you coffee in the 60s. You're going to be my sponsor in the 80s. And he said, okay. But he had been through that transition, too. He had gotten away from being involved as a newcomer to where he had gotten comfortable and doing a real great job in meetings. I'd been back about 5 months, and I'd only seen one alcoholic. His name was Vernon. I don't want to forget Vernon. Vernon was an old boy. I said, will you be my sponsor? And I was too dumb to say no. I said yes, and I didn't know what the hell a sponsor was. I mean, that's something we do on an ego trip, right? But Saturday morning he came in and he said, Cliff, I hate to ask you to do this, but I think I left my teeth at one of the beer joints down there on Harry Hines. Would you mind finding it? And not knowing what the hell a sponsor was supposed to do, I went down to Harry Hines and I hit every one of those beer joints. Now, you want to have a thrill walking a beer joint about 10 or 11 o'clock on Saturday morning and say, have you seen any teeth laying around here on the bar? You get some real weird looks. But the thing that I didn't understand was why I wasn't getting to feel better after that glow wore off, after I got dried out, after I found out I was back and I didn't have to drink anymore. And I remember sometime along this time of the year, 1983, sitting on the side of the bed with my deer rifle in my mouth, thinking about, I've had all I can stand. I'm not going to drink. I don't know what the hell's wrong. I'm going nuts. I'm coming unglued. And then I got thinking about the mess and all the problems I'd caused my family and what a hell of a note it'd be for them to have to come in and find me in that shape and all the stuff they'd have to clean up, so I didn't do it, and that's the only reason. My daughter didn't have enough fun growing up with an alcoholic dad, so she went out and married one and moved to Little Rock. And one of the tapes I'd been hearing was a guy named Joe that lived in Little Rock, and this guy really, well, he talked to me. I heard what he said. And I planned on meeting him or looking him up when I was up there for Christmas. And we went up Christmas, and I happened to go down to the Wolf Creek Foundation for a noon meeting just before Christmas. Joe hardly ever makes a discussion meeting. It maybe once in every 2 or 3 years he'll do it. But for some reason he happened to be there that day. The topic was step 3, and they were talking about step 3 in terms that I wasn't too familiar with because I'd been in our step 3 discussion meetings, and they didn't get very close to what really we were about. But the chairperson looked over my left shoulder and he said, Joe, what do you think about it? And Joe gave his response to it, and I turned around, and here was this guy. I had a picture in my mind of what Joe looked like. But I recognized this voice, and what I saw was a guy who was black, bald, and had the most beautiful smile I've ever seen on a man. Now, some of you may have been around long enough to remember that this, your group had a couple of guys from Arkansas named Joe and Charlie here. I think 2 or possibly 3 occasions where they came in here over a weekend, and if you weren't here, you missed one of the greatest opportunities in Alcoholics Anonymous to get your tailpipe lit to find out what this thing's about. I went up to him after that meeting, and I said, Joe, I've listened to this tape. Is there any chance I could have a little time with you while I'm here in Little Rock? And he said, sure, come on down. And I called Lane, my daughter, and told her I'd found this guy. I want to go spend some time with him, and so we went down to Serenity House. And we started talking a little bit, and Joe looked at me. The words he said and what I heard, I don't know if you ever get into this at all, but I keep hearing a lot of the kids I sponsor say, Cliff said. I never said that. I never said that at all. But that's what they heard, and this is what happened to me. What Joe said and what I heard was, Cliff, you don't know anything about alcoholism, and you damn sure don't know anything about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. That hurt my feeling, because I had over 6 years sitting in meeting time. And I sat there and I looked at this guy, and I started to get up, and the temptation was get up and walk out. I don't need this kind of put down. But I thought, fool, you came this far primarily to see your daughter and to meet this man. So we went into the library, and what he did was he pulled down this book. Nobody had ever done this for me before. And what he did was he pointed out right here, it had a dust cover on it. He said, do you know what it says down there? And I said, no, and he read it to me. This is the 3rd edition of the big book, the basic text for Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, do you know what a basic text is? And I said, yes, I do, Joe. I've got a master's in physics. I know what a basic text is. He said, this is the one we use in Alcoholics Anonymous. It appears you don't know very much about it. I didn't going to hit him, but he opened it up forward the first day. You got your big book. Let's get started on this thing. I want to give you an introduction to what turned my life around completely. Because that time with Joe on just before Christmas in 1983 was the beginning of a turnaround in Cliff Bishop's life. I can tell you today, I love being an alcoholic, and I couldn't be more pleased with the life that I've been given. We'll get into it in a little bit, maybe. Let's read this, and then we'll go back and see what my life's like today. Dale Wilson, in April of 1939, introduced this book to the world as follows. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. That kind of puts an end to this crazy debate we hear in the fellowship, whether we're recovering or recovering. We're recovering somewhere between step 3 and step 9, but once we had that spiritual experience, we've joined the first 100. We have recovered. And then he says to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. Joe said, do you know what the word precisely means? I said, of course I do. He said, that means you don't have any latitude in how you apply this to your life. Dr. Bob said there is no such thing as individual interpretation of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I believe Joe, and I've seen that in print since then. For them who help these pages are proved so convincing, no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person, and besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. Next to the last 2 sentences tell us that this book is for those that care about us as much as it is for us. We put people through absolute hell because of what we have done, and unfortunately what most of us are going to do. And they deserve and learn how to live a life that gives them happiness and peace of mind regardless of what we have done or will do. And this book tells them exactly how to do that, and on the 4th night, if I survive and you survive, we're going to get into that a little bit. How many in here still have a family? I want to see, how many still have a family? One of the greatest things I see and the greatest thrills I get is when I see an alcoholic recover, his family get into Al-Anon, Alateen, Alatot, and the family comes back together and has a healthy family unit. We're going to touch on that a little bit. But look at the last sentence. Besides, we're sure our way of living has its advantages for all. Do you know how many groups or fellowships have been formed out of this big book over the last 50 years? Mind-boggling. 220-some anonymous fellowships have picked up our 12 steps and 12 traditions to deal with problems that have nothing to do with drinking booze. Fantastic. Such a powerful, powerful program. A lot of historians say this is the greatest thing that happened in the 20th century. A lot of other historians say this is the greatest thing that's happened in 2,000 years. This. Just this. And those of us who try to put it to the test find out what it's about. It's about a quality of life that's beyond anything we have ever dreamed of. Let's get this over with. Go back to page 42 just a minute. Some of you know that's where old Fred's story is. Fred's a guy that was 12 steps, and he said, I don't have a problem. I'm not going to drink anymore. A year later, they found him in the hospital. They told him one thing. They said, Fred, if you got an alcoholic mind, you're going to drink again. He said, I'm not going to drink again. A year later, he was drunk, and he remembered. They told him. He remembered, he said, if you got an alcoholic mind, you will drink again, and he knew he had an alcoholic mind and decided he'd try this thing. If you look at the very last paragraph on page 42 in quotations, it says, quite as important was the discovery that spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I've since been brought into a way of living and infinitely more satisfying, I hope more useful than the life I've lived before. My old manner of living was by no means a bad one. But I would not exchange the best moments for the worst I have now. I wouldn't go back to it even if I could. That's what Fred said, and that's what Cliff Bishop was saying. I have never enjoyed life as much as I have over the last 17 years since Joe got me started on this thing, the way it's been laid out. Now, what he did to help me begin to understand that I wasn't powerless over people, places, and things, which I had been real super at in meetings, he gave me the doctor's opinion, and I had pretty well ignored the doctor's opinion because this was written back in 1939. What in the hell did that doctor know? One of the things that happened to me after I'd been back a short time was people looked at me and said, Cliff, you would make a wonderful counselor. You'd be good at that. Well, I was easily blown up. You know, all it took a little bit to get my ego going strong. And I thought they knew what they were talking about, so I got myself enrolled in one of these schools, and for 1 weekend a month for 2.5 years, I went through this educational process of learning what the tricks of the trade. It didn't take me very long to realize that what we had here was far more powerful than what I was learning out there, but I also learned an awful lot that came from there that I hear in our meetings today. But the one thing that I did recognize was that while we had an attitude around at some parts of our fellowship, that we now knew so much more about alcoholism, I began to recognize, no, that's not true at all. When we come in here, we're only dealing with two things, aren't we? We're dealing with a problem called alcoholism. Now, if you may forgive me for mentioning it, but in the Bible and Proverbs, King Solomon writes about people like me 3,000 years ago. I think if you look at the 23rd book of Proverbs, you'll find his commentary on people that spend their life drinking. What we know about alcoholism today is only confirmed that Dr. Silkworth's opinion is absolutely true. That where he believes that we have a physical allergy to alcohol, medical science has learned that we have a liver and pancreas that are deficient in the production of enzymes necessary to complete chemical decomposition through our body. You learned, Joe and Charlie brought that in here too. And then a little guy down in Houston learned that we also have the ability to manufacture a highly addictive chemical called tetrahydroisoquinoline planted right up here in the brain. Combining that with one of the products of chemical decomposition with ethanol, with our brain transmitters, neurotransmitters. So his doctor's opinion now is medically supported. But what Joe did to me, took me back on Roman numeral 26. And the very first paragraph tells us why we're powerless over alcohol. He said, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol in these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. That the phenomenon of cravings in this class that never occurs in the average temperate drinker. That didn't make any sense to me until Joe said, when you sat down and started drinking, do you ever get enough? I said, I don't know. What do you mean? He said, you said something about liking buttermilk. When you sat down and started drinking buttermilk, do you get enough? And I said, oh, yeah, a glass or so. That's plenty. He said, when you started drinking booze, a glass or so plenty, do you get enough? I said, oh, my God. He said, do you always drink too much? And I said, every time. When you sat down and started drinking, did you plan to have just a few? Yeah, I sure did. Did you wind up having a few, or did you get drunk every time? You got drunk every time. Sound like that allergy exists within your body. You must be powerless over alcohol. I'll be damned. That shows an awful lot of that hip stuff that I was throwing out in the discussion meetings. Because now I understood that the first half of step one, I was powerless over alcohol because I couldn't drink without getting drunk. And back on page 30, there's a story about a guy who couldn't drink without getting drunk. But he wanted to be successful in business, so he made up his mind he wouldn't drink, and for 25 years he didn't drink. You know the story. Was his life unmanageable at age 25 or age 30? Not at all. Powerless over alcohol, yeah, he couldn't drink without getting drunk, but he decided he wouldn't drink again, and for 25 years he managed that decision. And so Joe simply asked me a question: have you ever promised yourself faithfully you'd never drink again? I said, so many times. He said, if you could manage that decision, you wouldn't be talking here, you and I wouldn't be talking here today, would we? Oh my God. The simplicity of this thing is what kills us. Somebody asked Bill Wilson, can you tell us what define your program, tell us what it's like. And Bill said the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is a complete mystery shrouded in utter simplicity. Isn't that the truth? Boy, how my life is today, the way it is, and everything good in my life is a total mystery. And what I have to do to get it is so simple, it's almost sickening. Really. And I think this is probably one of the things that beats us to death. It is so simple we can't accept the simplicity. We get in and say, look at this big book, what we find out is it only takes 24 pages from the time we make up our mind we're going to try this thing until it's happened. 24 pages, and we'll pick that up next week. But let's go on with this thing. Let's go down to the last paragraph. Because what Joe did for me there was, he said that sentence as it reads, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol, is really not a true statement. Most men and women don't really like the effect produced by alcohol because once they've had a couple or three of them, they say, I've had enough, and they quit. They say, I'm beginning to feel it. I wonder, what the hell's the ideal? I mean, why don't? That's what I drink for, is to feel it. But he said if you put the word alcoholic men and women in front of there, then we've got a true statement. Alcoholic men and women love the effect produced by alcohol, don't we? Think about how much we love it. What all did we give up in the process of seeking that sense of ease and comfort that we get out of drinking? If Joe said, if you really want to know what the effect is, let's go back in the big book, page 83 and 84. He said, everything you need to know about what's wrong with you and what to do about it's in this book. And again, if you were in the Joe and Charlie Big Book Comes Alive deal, what I'm doing here is something that they did here also, I'm quite sure. Because the last paragraph on page 83 tells us, now we're going to have a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening. Somewhere between step 3 and step 9, we will have recovery. We'll have that complete change in the way we think and the way we feel. And that's what he says. He says that we're painstaking about this phase of our development. We'll be amazed before we're halfway through. And then he starts out with these promises that let us know what a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening or an entire psychic change is like. But what Joe did is he said, let's put these words in front of these promises. When I had a few drinks, did I know a new freedom and a new happiness? Yeah, I did. When I had a few drinks, did I regret the past or wish to shut the door on it? I hadn't really thought about that, and he said, have you ever come to in a place you hadn't planned to be with people you hadn't planned to be with, having done some things you wish you had not done? I said, a lot of times. He said, were you ashamed of it? And I said, so ashamed. Was it something you want to tell anybody about? And I said, no way at all. Did you ever go in a bar and have a couple of drinks that night and corner some poor sucker and tell him the whole thing? And I said, I sure did. And I'll bet you did too. When I had a few drinks, I comprehended the word serenity and I knew peace. When I had a few drinks, no matter how far down the scale I'd gone, I could see how my experience could benefit others. Did that ever happen to you? People that I ran around with drank like I did. I didn't run around with those other people because that wasn't a normal way of living for me. But if you drank like I did, you had problems. Maybe you just got out of jail, or maybe you just lost your car. Here are the keys. I don't know where it is. Or maybe you just got fired, or maybe you just had divorce papers served. And when something like that happened, they felt it necessary to talk to somebody, and sometimes you might have been the lucky person. And if you had to be that person, being the loving soul you were, you listened to them for about 45 seconds before you say, you think you got a problem? Let me tell you about mine. And we started giving our life story, didn't we? We wanted them to know that they didn't really have a problem. How about the next one? When I had a few drinks, that feeling of uselessness and self-pity would disappear. When I had a few drinks, I lost interest in selfish things, gained interest in my fellows. When I had a few drinks, my whole attitude and outlook upon life changed. Oh boy, did it ever. When I had a few drinks, fear of people and economic insecurity would leave me. You ever wind up in a party sober? Did you like being there? One of the most miserable things we could ever experience is wind up in a group of people sober. And as a result of that, almost all of us had a few before we ever started left for the party, right? If we got there sober, we would have known the most social people that ever in that party. We didn't want to talk to anybody, didn't want to be around anybody. Get away and leave me alone until the guy came by with a couple of drinks, and then what happened? I got to talk to somebody about something. We get real social. And if the band's playing and we're dry, can't get us on the dance floor. Give us a couple of drinks and the band decides it's break time and we're not through dancing, we just don't quit. We keep right on. Financial insecurity, here's the first of the month. I'm a little bit shy on money. Look at all these bills. Think I better go down and figure out what to do, so I'll go down and have a couple of drinks. Well, I'm not worrying about the bills while I'm drinking. When I get back, there are the bills, but the money's gone. If I still have a credit card, I'm in worse shape than I was before I left. Next one says, when I had a few drinks, I intuitively knew how to handle situations that used to baffle me. Did? I think it's one of the things we all pick up, alcoholics pick up on in the early days of our drinking. Give me a couple of drinks, I think so much better when I've had a couple. I come up with answers that nobody's even asked a question for yet. And the last one is the promise of our program. We'll suddenly realize that God's doing for us what we can't do for ourselves. Never has been a self-help program, it's a God-help program. But I did not, and I suppose most of us don't suddenly realize that alcohol was doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. It took me quite a while to come to recognize that alcohol had been my solution for living. Because that job that I got fired from, I felt totally incompetent, totally insecure. And since it was required that we pass our drinking test, and I did that, and we drank every day, that was part of the job. I get up in the morning feeling like I don't want to do a thing. I don't have anything to do with this job. I'm not qualified for it. I'd have a couple of drinks, and all of a sudden I was ready to take on the world. Alcohol was my competence. It gave me that security. It made me fit it and let me be a part of. Without it, I was apart from. Alcohol was my solution for living until it became almost my death. And that's the way it is with every alcoholic. So back to Roman number 26. We're still figuring out why alcoholics drink the way they do. The next sentence says, the sensation is so elusive, while we admit it's curious, we cannot after a time differentiate the truth from the false. That was a weird sentence. But Joe said, did anybody ever ask you why you drank? And I said, early on, I said, of course. And he said, what was your answer? And I said, I don't know. He said, that was the truth, wasn't it? I said, it sure was. And he said, what did they say? And they said, yes, you do. And then what'd you do? I came up with a reason. I'll bet you did too. I'll bet you learned how to be a big liar right on the spot. World-class liar. And I developed enough of those over those years I was drinking. When I came to AA the first time around, I had stories that I'd said out in meetings that would bring tears to your eyes, and there wasn't a damn bit of truth in them. But this is a program of rigorous honesty, and as a result of that, I didn't get to stay. But boy, they impressed people. How about the next one? We admit it's injurious, did we? It's awfully hard to get a public intoxication rap without being a little drunk. It's awfully hard to get a DWI without that. It's pretty hard to wind up in a hospital for intoxication if we haven't been drinking. Pretty hard to get fired for drinking on the job if we haven't been drinking. And occasionally we do begin to recognize, yeah, alcohol's causing me a problem. But then Dr. Silkworth gives us a bit of it. He says, we cannot after a time differentiate the truth from the false. And I did not understand what that meant until Joe said, our mind lies to us. We live a lie. We cannot remember the truth, and the truth is if we start drinking, we're going to get drunk. What we can remember is the last sentence on that page. He said, we're restless, irritable, and discontent unless we can again experience that sense of ease and comfort that comes at once with taking a few drinks. Drinks which we see others taking with impunity. But after we have succumbed to that desire, so many of us do, the phenomenon of craving develops. We pass through the well-known states of us pre-emerging remorseful with a firm resolution. Honey, I'm never ever going to do it again, so help me God, and we mean it. The unmanageability is right here in the next sentence. This is repeated over and over. Well, if you and I, as hopeless alcoholics, can experience an entire psychic change, we're not going to recover. And the reason we have to experience an entire psychic change through the steps is because we experience an entire psychic change as a result of our first few drinks. And our mind's going to insist we get that. I don't know how many of you have ever wound up drunk and couldn't remember where you were or what you were doing when you took the first drink. I do. And where I hang out a lot of people do. Find themselves dead drunk and can't remember where they were when they took the first drink. It happens to us. Well, we'll go over through Bill's story and read his story, and we begin to see how step 1 and 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 work in his life. To be 12-step by Bill Wilson is, to me, is one of the real miracles of our program. Because I read Bill's story, I can see where I went through the same things that he did. The thing that's so amazing to me is that when I was born, there was no Alcoholics Anonymous. There was no hope for people like me. I was 11 years old when Bill and Dr. Bob met. I was 15 when this book was written. It was published in April of 1939. I had my first drink Thanksgiving Eve of 1939. 6 months after this book was written, they wrote my life story, and I hadn't even had a drink. But over on page 8, I can see where Bill took step 1. Over on page 12, I can see where Eddie kept bringing in and saying, Eddie, or Bill, I found a way. Haven't had a drink in 2 months. I've never enjoyed life so much. And from that, Bill got his hope. Step 2, and that's why his speaker meetings are so important. That's why these stories in this big book are so important. To help us recognize that people have found a solution to this hopeless condition of mind and body. The thing that impresses me is the way they attacked recovery back when this book was written, over on page 13. And I hammer this home to all the kids I work with. We don't sit around and spend much time going to meetings. We get very involved in taking the steps right up front. But on page 13, the first paragraph, Bill says he went to the hospital, had the last drink. It was December the 11th, 1934. He's going into DTs. He'd been told just a short time before he's either going to die of a heart attack during DTs or he was going to become a wet brain. Bill was going into DTs, figured he better get back to the hospital to try to ward off that heart attack. He entered the hospital on December the 11th, going into DTs, and 3 days later Eddie came by to see him one more time. In the next paragraph, he said, there I humbly offered myself to God. Is that step 3? He did that on December 14th, the third day after his last drink. And then he said, my schoolmate visited me. Bill's in Towns Hospital. This is the 4th and 5th day that Eddie came up and spent a little bit of time with Bill and helped him take what we now know as step 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Learned how to do 10 and 11, left the hospital with a spiritual experience, never had another drink, lived 36 years. And you and I are here because Bill Wilson recovered in the first week of his sobriety. I think if you know Dr. Bob's story, you know that Dr. Bob was 12-step by Bill on May 12th, 1935. Dr. Bob understood for the first time what was wrong with him because a broken-down stockbroker from New York sat down and told Dr. Bob what alcoholism was, and Dr. Bob said, my God, I didn't know. But he said, you're doing okay. What do I have to do? And so Bill told him. Dr. Bob had agreed to spend 15 minutes with Bill Wilson, didn't he? They spent 15 years together and kept Bill there for 3 months before they let him go back to New York. Dr. Bob started his sobriety the very first day after his last, well, it was the first day of his last drunk. He had his last drink on June 10th, or last drink on June 10th, didn't he, just before he did surgery. The one thing he had not been willing to do the 3 weeks before was make amends, so that evening he went out and he made them. He lived 15 years and never had another drink, and the next day, the very first day of his sobriety, he said, Bill, don't we need to find another alcoholic to work with? Go back to page 157. All know the story of AA number 3, old Bill Dawson, the attorney. Go over and start out on page 157, and they're sitting there talking. Bill and Dr. Bob talked to this guy. He said there isn't any hope. But then over on page 158, second say that paragraph says, on the third day the lawyer gave his life to the care and direction of his Creator. What's that? Step 3. You see, the people who wrote this book didn't sit around going to meetings. They didn't have any meetings to go to. The meetings they had was with Bill and Dr. Bob talking to each other. Then Bill Dawson in the hospital. They spent a lot of time looking for other alcoholics, and then finally they got around to having one meeting a week. One of the things that's been a real education for me is the opportunities Wayne and I've had to travel around the country and visit some places, and one of the places we visited a few times is a place called Akron. And one of the things that absolutely blew me away up there is to find out the most successful group we've ever known in Alcoholics Anonymous. The King School group meets right now. Wednesday night, one meeting. That's all they have. One meeting a week. It's amazing to watch these people. I've been able to spend a little bit of time with them, and they are very, very dedicated to doing the one thing that we're all required to do, and that is go out, find alcoholics, and to try to cure them. But back to what we're about here. The thing that impressed me was that I had been sitting around trying to get well going to meetings, and Joe informed me I couldn't get well going to meetings. I had to take the action that the first 100 laid down for us, and they gave us very specific, clear-cut directions on how to do this in the big book. He went ahead and he did one other thing. Let's go over to page 44. He did several things, but I've got to breeze through this because time's running out and I always got too much to say and never enough time to say it once you get me wound up. I was one of those that was told to get into the 12 and 12 when I got back. And I was one of those I told I ought to start out on chapter 5 when I got in the big book. Let's go to page 30 first, and then we'll come back up here. Because this is one of the things that Joe did. He really hammered home to me. Right in the middle of page 30, it said, we learned we had to fully concede to our innermost self where alcoholics lie. It's the first step in recovery. If we have a burning desire to ever take another drink, the first thing we've got to do is to understand what alcoholism is and why we have been so unsuccessful in our attempts to avoid that next drink. But now we're on page 44. First paragraph kind of rings it for us. He said, in the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. I hate to tell you, I'd sat around meetings for over 6 years and didn't learn anything about alcoholism. I learned an awful lot about what alcoholism does to alcoholics. But to tell you what alcoholism was, I couldn't tell you until Joe got through with me that very few moments before Christmas of 1983. But here's where we wound up. He said, we hope he made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and non-alcoholic. He said, you know who Alcoholics Anonymous is for? And I said, yeah. He said, you understand the 5th edition? I said, I sure do. He said, we're here for alcoholics, not non-alcoholics. But he said, let's take the test. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely. You ever say you'll never drink again? Yep. You drink again? Yep. Flunked that one, didn't you? Yep. Life's unmanageable, isn't it? You can't manage a decision to resist the first drink. If you could, you'd never need to come to Alcoholics Anonymous. That's it. Or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you must be powerless over alcohol. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Joe said, do you have any idea how many meetings you got to go to have a spiritual experience? I never ever had anybody ask me that question before, and I can't tell you how many people. I said, don't drink, go to meetings, you'll be okay. Joe shot that one down for me big time. How many meetings do I have to go to have a spiritual experience? How many meetings do I have, PTA meetings do I have to go to become a parent? It doesn't happen going to meetings, does it? It takes a very precise course of action. I got 3 kids. I know about that. No, we do not get well by going to meetings. We should be going to meetings to hear a recovered alcoholic tell us what they were like, what happened, and what they're like now, so we can get the hope that Abby gave Bill. So we can get the hope that Bill gave Dr. Bob. So we can get the hope that Bill Dotson got from Bill and Dr. Bob. So we can get the hope that I got from Joe McHugh. A recovered alcoholic telling us what they were like, what happened, and what they're like now gives us that hope. And where's that fit in step 2? Came to believe. And in our fellowship today, the word believe means I hope. I think this thing might work for me. I believe it will. I see it work for you. I believe it will. And what's the insanity? I don't know about you, but after having been driving 15 or 16 years, driving 70 miles for a 6-pack of beer is not a sane act when I've been hospitalized 7 times to keep from dying drunk. Now, I don't know what you did drinking. But if you were anything like the rest of us, you probably have had one of these experiences where you either got fired, you got picked up by the cops, got out of jail, maybe a divorce, fired off a job, all these wonderful things that happen to us. all because we were drinking. We get dried out, walk into a liquor store and say, I had so damn much fun doing all that stuff, I want to try it one more time, will you sell me another bottle? That, dear friends, is a totally insane act, and that is the product of an alcoholic mind, and that is the reason our life is unmanageable. Because of an alcoholic mind that will insidiously lead us right back in the liquor store or bar, totally dry, after all the experience we've had, and say, I want to try it one more time. I need to find that sense of ease and confidence. We're going to be restored to sanity. We will be given the power. Did it say we will? It says no. It could. Could happen. Came to believe that a power greater than himself could restore us to sanity. I saw that power in Keith, I saw it in Paul, and I saw it in Joe. They had this sanity. They were enjoying being who they were. I wasn't. And what Joe said, well, you get home and get with your sponsor. Oh, he said, oh, do you really think this thing's working for me? And I said, my God, is it ever? He said, do you have any hope that it might work for you? And I said, I sure do. He said, that's step 2. Now, are you willing to do what I do? And I said, I don't know what the hell you do, Joe. He said, it's all in the book. Everything I do is right here in this book. I live my life within the pages or the covers of this book. Do you think you could do that? And he pointed out a few things. The simplicity. He showed me where we make a decision on page 64 that we're going to do this thing. We start out on page 63, we make the decision. Start out on page 64 with step 4. We get over to page 88, having learned how to do step 11, to pray and meditate. And by that time, we've been given the power. That's 24 pages. It takes us from a state of hopelessness to the state of being recovered. Step 3 is simply a decision in my mind to find a sponsor who knows what this program is about, who's had a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening. And go to that person and say, will you be my sponsor? And then be willing to do precisely what that sponsor tells us to do. Every once in a while I get a hold of one today and they say, how mean are you? They've already heard the rumor. I say, I'm going to own the air you breathe, kid. Because if you want this thing, we're going to do it exactly the way they did, because, you see, I know it works. Now, I do not, in fact, I was an actuary, I don't keep statistics, but I do have one measure. A few years ago, I was cleaning after I retired, I cleaned out my file. And I ran across my Christmas card list. And I started, just out of curiosity, I started counting the people that we on that list that I had worked with who were doing it the way the book says we're supposed to do it. And I counted 75 people. And I went back and checked. Out of that 75, 4 of them had gone back to drinking. This covered about an 8 or 9 year period. And out of those 4, 2 of them are already back. One of them was already a GSR for our group. Since that time, it's been about 6 years ago that I looked at that. We've had one more go back out. A few of them had died sober. But lose 3 out of 75 to alcoholism when they doing it by the book. What Bill tells us back on page Roman numeral 20? Anybody remember? Giving us an account of what happened the very first 20 years of our history. For the second edition is a historical account of how we found Dr. Bob and how they got AA started and all the wonderful things that happened that first 20 years. But if you go back to Roman numeral 20, I think one of the most important things that we've got in that particular section of the book is what Bill considered to be an important statement, because 5 lines down he said of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober once and remained that way. Can you believe that half of them got sober and never took another drink? I do. Because I know what they did then. This is one of the things I've gotten so interested in our history, not to be a historian, but to go back and see what they did in the early days when they were so successful and compare it with what we're doing today when we're such a miserable failure. Now, I'm not talking about the ODAC group. I'm talking about Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole. If you look at Box 459 and follow that June, July statistic that they put out every year on our count membership, if you'll recognize for the first time in our history, from 1998 to 1999, we have a decrease in membership, significant decrease. I mean, we've gone negative. Over the 90s, we went from a 7% success rate to less than 1.5%, and then we went down below. It seems like the more discussion meetings we have, the fewer people are staying sober, because we're getting away from helping them experience what's in this book. See, back when they wrote this book, they either got on the program right up front or they got back out. There wasn't any place for the part-timers. Dr. Bob said, you either do it or get out. They all did. But of the half that went back out, half of them came back. They had 75% success when the only thing we have is the big book, sponsors who use the big book, and one meeting a week. Isn't that amazing? And you know how well you're doing here. Your group has got some sort of measure of how well you're doing here. And I hope that when newcomers, I sent a bunch of newcomers out here and hope, because I know you have a number of probably more big book studies in the ODAC group than any other group in Dallas for the number of meetings you have. We 4 of them, is that right? Oh my God, somebody in this group ought to know how many. Well, 4 is what you got in the directory. That's why I send people out here, because I'm hoping that they're going to have a chance to learn what our program is. Anybody ever hear about the gift of sobriety? Ain't no such thing. This is our gift. This is what we have been given. Well, you pay $6 for it or whatever you're charging, but it's a gift. Sobriety is not a gift. We've got to earn it. And if you have any doubt about it, go to page 14. We'll see where Bill tells us. Next week we're going to get into recovery. Quit talking about all this other jazz. First paragraph says, simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. Simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. Does that sound like a gift? No, we got to do it. It meant self-destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. Everything? Everything. One other thing I want to leave, and maybe you can play around with some of your meetings. It's something I picked up at added fuel to the fire. A transcript of a talk by a guy named Bob Bacon. Bob was the delegate of the northeast section of Ohio. He covered the delegate for Akron back in the 70s. 1976, he addressed a conference, and what he said in 1976, 24 years ago, is, folks, we are denying the newcomer what they're entitled to. We're no longer telling them about the big book. We're no longer telling them the importance of the 12 steps. We're no longer telling them about the importance of the 12 traditions. We've gotten around where we want to tell our drunkalogs, talk about our ideas, our problems, our opinions, and the way we do it. We're denying the newcomer what they're entitled to because they paid the price to get you. I'm going to leave it here for you. I sat down and read this, and I got tears thinking what a mess I had made out of the lives of so many people by the ignorance. Because we're going to pass on what we've been taught. What we have been taught is what we're going to pass on to the newcomer. I can't tell you how many I probably led right back to the bottle and death because I didn't know better. Today I do know better. Today when I get a hold of a new one, we find out real quick, are you willing to go to any length? Here's your book. Go read it. And when you've got through with it, come back and tell me you're ready to do it. And if you are, we're going to do it right now. It works real well. I am so glad to be out here. I've been wondering what the hell this ODAC group looks like. It looks pretty good. I'm glad there's so many thick ones here tonight. I hope the weather's a little better next week. And I hope I didn't run you off. I really hope I didn't, because next week we're going to get into the good stuff. The simplicity of this program, how utterly simple it is. If we simply follow the direction that God gave to Bill in the first 100, that we preserve now for 61 years, and the 4th edition is going to read exactly the way this one reads because nobody's found a way to improve on it. God willing, I'll see you all next Wednesday night. If you know a better way to get from Royal and Marsh out here than the toll road, tell me about it, because that is a mess over there, too. See you next week. Well, I realized I'm in the right place tonight after I saw that desired-ship presentation. God, it made me feel so much better. Thank you for that one. My name is Cliff. Oh, before I get started, if you want to know how I got the black eye, my wife didn't do it to me. I disagreed with my sponsor. No, in all honesty, I was up in the attic and I had some stuff in my hand and I started putting that folding ladder back up and it slipped out of my hand, hit me here and then bounced here, and want a good look at it? Isn't that lovely? I graduated from high school the same way. Anyway, my name's Cliff Butcher and I'm a real alcoholic. Also a serious and very enthusiastic member of the Alcoholics Anonymous. And because of a loving God I found through our 12 steps, a loving, lovely Al-Anon wife that stayed home tonight. The sponsor that taught me how to follow the directions that came with the steps in this book. And many, many people exactly like you. I'm enjoying my 6,495th day of sobriety, and I, by God, live living sober. By God. And I do apologize. I thought I'd take a shortcut and get here tonight. I'll stick with the toll road next week. But anyhow, we got into it last week on why we're here. We're here because we have a desire to stop drinking, and that's the only legitimate excuse to come to Alcoholics Anonymous. And once we get here, if we have a good sponsor, we get into the doctor's opinion and learn we're powerless over alcohol because of a physical allergy, a sensitivity to alcohol that deprives us of the ability to control the amount we drink once we start. So the smart thing to do is don't start. And I lack the power to manage that decision and not start, and I made it many times. But fortunately, a guy from Alcoholics Anonymous came to see me on September 15, 1964, told me his story. And from that, I got the hope that maybe there is a solution here. It took me 20 years to find the solution, but at least he got me where I had the solution would be available. And step 3, the hope of that was step 2, and step 3 was simply a decision to take the rest of the steps and see if it'd work for me. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I got off on this real early, because I didn't. It took me 19 years to find Joe McHugh, and 20 years before I finally got around to really taking the steps. Over on page 19, and you're all supposed to have your big book. Now, why don't you have your big book? This is a step study. Well, I'm going to have to go back and start all over right at the beginning because you didn't pay attention. If you went to Roman numeral 13, somebody's got a little red book over there. It's the second page. But on Roman numeral 13 in the blue book, it says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. I thought that's the main purpose of meetings for a long time. And then finally Joe said, no. If you want to recover from alcoholism, you're going to have to do what's in the book. And so I finally dug it out, dusted it off, and started getting into it. But on page 19, it says the elimination of drinking is but a beginning. I thought that was the living end of this thing. A much more important demonstration of our 12 steps lies before us in our respective homes, occupations, and affairs. And I thought not drinking was the whole bit, and I found out no. Bill's absolutely right. Not drinking is not such a big deal except right after we hit that period of where we can go for a while. After a period of time, most of us get restless, irritable, and discontented in sobriety. We're miserable. You know who commits suicide? Almost the highest rate of people commit suicide in our country today are people who are alcoholics, who are early enough in their sobriety, in their disease, that they can make a decision not to drink. And they can manage that decision, but they also don't have a program of action. And as a result of that, they can't tolerate life, and we go blow ourselves off. But over on page 24, Bill tells us we've got a week or a month after our last drink to realize and remember the misery and suffering we went through. That soon is when we need to get involved. Pretty quick. And over on page 29, 3 lines down from the top, it tells you why we need a big book if we're going to try the steps, because it says further on clear-cut directions are given showing how we recovered, the first 100, and all of us who followed those directions since then. We get over into chapter 5, page 58. I don't know how often you hear it, but I hear it every once in a while. People say, I don't know how it works, and when I hear that, I want to go up to hit them right beside the head, right here, with a big book and say, damn it, read the book. What's the title of chapter 5? How it works. What's the very first sentence? Rarely have we seen a person fail who had thoroughly followed our path. That's how it works. Very well. Very well. But then he goes ahead, and I brought along a copy of the way Bill wrote it in the original manuscript. I'll leave it here. I love it. It took me a long time to hear that, and the first time I heard it, it sent chills down my back, because after we got through the ABCs as we understand them today, Bill wrote one sentence in there that they took out. And what he wrote was, if you're not convinced of these vital issues, you ought to reread the book at this point or else throw it away. What a hell of an idea. If you don't know you've got a killer disease and you don't think this thing might work, don't mess with it. Get on. Do whatever you're going to do. But don't waste your time in here. If you do realize how desperate it is and you do think this thing may work, then we need to get into it. And over on page 59, this is a spiritual program. And as a result of that, we're going to find a number of prayers. We invite God to be a part of our recovery. The very first surrender we've got to make is to the fact that we're hopeless alcoholics. That alcohol is our master. The second surrender we have to make is down about 5 lines, on page 59. The very first prayer we run into. We ask His protection and care with complete abandon. total surrender to the program. I didn't know that. I really thought if I went to enough meetings that would happen. Well, when I would go into enough meetings, I got bored where I couldn't stand any more meetings, so I went out and got drunk again. But then he goes ahead and he said, here are the steps we took. He doesn't say here are the meetings we went to. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. Now, sometimes think we abuse that word suggested as this is some sort of a smorgasbord. We can do it any way we want to. Dr. Bob didn't agree with that. He said there's no such thing as individual interpretation of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I believe that in my heart of hearts. What we did do, though, they said they took the steps. They approached this thing from a program of action. And they go on over to page 60, and right after the ABCs, it said, being convinced, we're at step 3, which is that we decide to turn our will and life over to God as we understand Him. Just what do we mean by that? Well, that question's answered on page 61 and 62, isn't it? And just what do we do? That question is answered with 63 to page 164. Precisely what we do to go about recovering. And over on page 62, the first paragraph tells us what the problem is. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our trouble. Who thought that? The people who wrote the book, Recovered Alcoholics. I certainly didn't think that was my problem. And then I really got tricked into having a spiritual experience. And I'll tell you about it now, and then we'll get back to the book. Because the way it happened to me is the way that Abby did it with Bill in Towns Hospital, because the guy that did it to me, old Paul Timpany, had been sponsored by a guy named Clarence Snyder. And he did it exactly the way they did then, and what he did with me. On May 27, 1984, the second greatest day of my life, he came to the house at 1:30. He said, you get rid of Elaine. Elaine walked out the door. He walked in. He said, are you ready? And I said, yep. He said, get on your knees. And I got on my knees. He said, pray the prayer. I prayed the prayer. We're going to talk about that prayer in a minute. He said, get up, sat down. I got up, sat down. He pushed a legal pad of paper in front of me. It had to be a legal pad in his mind or it wasn't legal. And then he said, write your name, date. This is my four-step inventory. I wrote my name May 27th, 1984. This is my four-step inventory. And he said, who are you pissed off at? And I told him. He said, why? If you go back and look on page 13, that's exactly what Abby did to Bill, wasn't it? He acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. We made a list of people I'd hurt and toward whom I felt resentment. And that's exactly what we did. In about 2.5 hours, we'd gone through my resentments, my fears, my sexual misconduct. At the end of that time, he said, do you see what a selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, pride, and inconsiderate asshole you are? And I said, yes, I do. He said, are you like what you see? And I said, no, I do not. Who do you want me to take my fifth step with, Paul? And he said, he asked me one more question. He said, are you willing to go to any length to become different? And I said, yes, I really am. Who do you want me to take my fifth step with? And he said, Cliff, you're ready for step 7. You see, what happened with me was I got a hold of a guy who had done this so often that he had this thing really perfected. And he drew stuff out of me that I'd never even admit to myself. And he left me and told me go ahead and spend my hour with the book. And we're going to get into this in a moment, but I'm clearing out how this happened to me. Elaine fixed dinner. We had a little bit to eat, and the relief I felt was probably that I'm not going to have to go through this again. He's off my back, and we can shut up and get on with it now. But that night there was a movie on television called The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. I don't know if anybody ever saw that. But the God I know and love today has a wonderful sense of humor, because right in the middle of that movie, he decided to let himself be known to me. The room lit up. I felt something flow over and through me. I can't describe it. But during that 20 minutes or so, I knew two things. I knew I'd never have to have another drink, and I knew I'd never have to have another problem, and I didn't know that that's one of the promises of this book. That in these 12 steps, I have a solution to all my problems. Word turned out that way. That was a life-changing event for me, and I haven't been the same since. I didn't know exactly what to do, so I went back up to Little Rock, and Joe told me what to do, and we've been doing it ever since. But let's get back to the way they decided on how this should be done. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our trouble. Do we? No, we really don't. It's their problem, isn't it? It's all their fault. If they'd just do what I want them to do, life would be okay. If they didn't treat me so badly, I wouldn't have to drink, right? Well, not quite as much, maybe. But they knew. They had been there. They had taken the action. They knew the truth. And we still are fishing for it. So over on page 63, right in the middle of the page, it says we're now at step 3. The thing I love about the big book is it tells me when to take a step, how to take a step, what the results will be, and it gives me a prayer for each and every step to invite God to be a part of my recovery. Such an amazing thing happens when I started doing what these folks did, because I've been getting exactly what they reported they got. But anyway, he gives us this prayer. God, I offer myself to you to build with me and do with me as you will. Relieve me of the bondage of my selfishness, that I may better do what you want me to do. Take away all of my problems and difficulties, and victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of your power, your love, your way of life. May I do your will always. No amen. Didn't realize that that was not the end of that prayer. There's an exclamation mark. May I do your will always. Heck of a deal, isn't it? Been living my life my way and almost killed me. I've been living my life his way, and it's the greatest thing that ever happened. But when do we take step 3? When we're convinced of the ABCs. That I'm powerless over alcohol, I can't manage my life, that no human power is going to relieve my alcoholism. I tried a doctor, a minister, and a psychiatrist. They all said, clear, if you're an alcoholic, go to AA, and I didn't like any of them. But they were right. Absolutely right. God can and will if He sought, and here are the directions we apply to our life to seek God. And He's not hard to find. Bill said He makes it real easy for those who are willing to follow the directions. How do we take step 3? First into the next paragraph. We found it very desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person. Who's the most understanding person we could ever take it with? A recovered alcoholic, and hopefully that's my sponsor. Somebody that's been there and done it and knows what it's about. And then what's going to happen? Well, look at the last sentence of that little paragraph. This was only a beginning, though if honestly and humbly made. In effect, sometimes a very great one was felt at once. But then Bill defines what we do precisely after that prayer. Next, we locked out on the course of vigorous action. It doesn't say we're going to go to a lot of meetings. It says we're going to get busy putting these steps to the test. And over on page 64, Bill tells us exactly when to start. First, our top line far right says, though our decision, step 3, was a vital and crucial step, it had little permanent effect unless at once followed by step 4, and that's exactly what Paul did to me. Get up, sat down, and let's do it. And it worked. How do we do it? We've got an awful lot of geniuses in our fellowship. I'll tell you, we got some of them more. But people are smarter than God, obviously, because they come up with the most advanced guide for the 4th step that I have ever seen. I ran into one that had 20-some pages, 200-some questions, and that wasn't enough, so they added 2 more pages and 30 more questions. That didn't work either. I saw one not long ago. It had 60-some pages to it. What's wrong with what they've got in the big book? 6 pages tell us exactly how to do the 4th step of Alcoholics Anonymous. So simple. See, this is what kills us. This program is so simple, we smart folks can't accept the simplicity. We've got to go ahead and romance and add to, take from, and massage this thing where there's no recognition. And the reason they wrote the big book was one purpose, wasn't it? To make sure our message would not be garbage. I don't know how it is out here. I think it's pretty good out here from what I know of the ODAC group. You got 4 big book studies going out here during a week. You've got a good group. And that's the reason I send people out this way. How do we do step 4? Last paragraph on page 64 tells us resentment's the number one offender, destroys more alcoholics than anything else. Guys, doesn't it? I've got 4 sobriety dates. 2 and 3 are because of resentment. I know what that means today. But then he makes a statement. Dr. Silkworth told us we were sick physically and mentally, didn't he? Bill adds that other dimension, the most important dimension. He says, for from it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we've been not only mentally and physically ill, we've been spiritually sick as well. And that's what it's all about. But then there's a promise. Once spiritual maladies been overcome, we straighten out physically and mentally. Isn't that amazing? So you really stop and think about what your life was like, your physical being, your mental being, before taking the steps and what life's been like since. It absolutely blows my mind. But how do we do it? In dealing with resentments, we put them down on paper. Does that indicate we got it right? One group I first wound up with almost went to pieces, being a big discussion. What discussion? It was a knockdown drop out, but whether or not we write the 4th step. We had a few attorneys in there and said, you never put that stuff on paper, and so there we got going. Of course, those attorneys all went and got drunk, and so everybody wrote it down, and they're okay. I'm not going any further with that one. How do we do it? Bill Gadd tells us exactly how to do it on page 64, and then he shows us how to apply it on page 65. I gotta tell you, it took Joe a long time to get through to me on this one, but it didn't. Once we got into it, it became as simple. We listed people, institutions, or principles. Isn't that what the book says? Let's go over on page 65. You haven't got a big book, you're just out of luck right now. But we have 3 columns on page 65. The first one says, I'm resentful at, and that's blank, so we're going to fill it in. And we were going to list the people we're really upset at as Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, my boss, and my wife. We know who we're mad at. We don't need anybody to help us. We know who we're mad at. We know who we're pissed off at. We know who we want to put a contract out on. We know who we want to get even with. I mean, we've got that down pat. We have spent many hours with a bottle sitting around planning their demise. So anyway, we got them listed. And we know exactly why it is that they're listed. In the next sentence says, we asked ourselves why we were angry. Well, old Brown, I'm mad at him because he's messing around with my wife. Told my wife about my girlfriend, he's trying to get my job at the office. Is that a reason to be mad at him? You betcha. How about Miss Jones? She got old Jonesy committed for drinking. He's my drinking buddy, and she's a gossip. She's running around telling the neighborhood it's all my fault. Mad at my boss because the sucker's going to fire me because I'm doing a little bit of drinking on the job and stealing a little bit of his money. And I'm mad at my wife because she likes Brown messing around with her, and she wants a house in her name, and that kind of spells it out real clear, doesn't it? Why is this happening? Well, first of all, I've got to take a look at something I never looked at before. I did not realize until I got involved in this thing that I have 3 basic instincts that are my drives. They're the things that make me go. I didn't realize that I had a social instinct, a need to belong, to be a part of. And of course, that's one of the greatest blessings we're given when we come to Alcoholics Anonymous, isn't it? People who say, we understand, please come back. Out there, they say, get the hell out of here and don't come back. Our social instinct begins to be fed properly when we get in here. How about security? Nice to own a little bit of money, to own some property. Most of us have insurance on the things we consider important, valuable. And how about our sex instinct? It's for procreation, the expression of love, but it feels pretty doggone good, and we have a habit of winding up in the wrong place with the wrong people doing the wrong thing. Our instincts are what feed us. Our instincts are our drives. The instincts are the things that motivate us. And unfortunately, alcoholics are driven by their instincts because they have to do with our feelings. And we operate on our feelings and our emotions. I'll bet you have. I'll bet you've had that debate going in your head we'll talk about in a little bit. Well, we go over and see what it puts one of my instincts it affects. Brown's messing around with my wife. That interferes with my sex life, and it also hurts my feelings, my self-esteem. Told my wife about my girlfriend. That really messes up my sex life, and that hurt my feelings too. I see somebody's been there also. I'm mad at old Brown because he's going to get my job at the office. That hurts my feelings, and that's going to hurt my pocketbook. Mad at Mrs. Jones because she's telling everybody I'm responsible for old Jonesy being in the nut house. Well, that interfered with a personal relationship, my drinking buddy, and it hurts my feelings that she's talking about me so badly. Mad at my boss because the sucker's going to fire me. Well, that's going to hurt my feelings, and that's going to hurt my pocketbook. And I'm mad at my wife because she wants Jonesy in my bed, Brown in my bed. Hurts my pride and my sex relations, and my feelings are going to be horribly hurt. Material security is shot. Well, then all of a sudden I'm beginning to see something that I hadn't seen before, that I hadn't realized that was a threat to the way I live. That was a threat to me. That was a threat to Cliff Bishop, whoever Cliff Bishop was, and he needed to be different than he was, but that's what he was at that time. And so we get on over on page 67. Why Bill leaves this out, I don't know. It's sort of a mystery that he's so clear on the first 3 columns, but we come over to column 4, and he doesn't display it. It comes over right in the middle of page 67. Column 4 is described as follows. Referring to our list again and putting out of our minds the wrongs others have done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and prideful. What Bill tell us the problem was? Selfishness, self-centeredness, and here are the manifestations of that. Well, got to put out of my mind the wrongs others have done, so let's go back over on page 65. I'm mad at my boss. We all work for this sucker. He's going to fire me because I'm drinking on the job and padding my expense account. If you own the business and you got a guy stealing your money and drinking on the job, what are you going to do with him? You're going to fire him. And here I am mad at the guy for doing the only thing he needs to do with a guy like me. He can't afford me. I'm a liability to him. Stealing his money and drinking on the job, I present a serious liability. He's got to fire me. Let's go up the top. Let's look at Brown and my wife. That becomes a little bit more difficult because who's wrong up there? Brown and my wife? Well, over here on page 67 it says, putting out of my mind the wrongs others had done. Got to disregard what they're doing. But as I sat down and take a look at this now, I began to see why Brown and my wife have got that thing going. Because Brown knew about my girlfriend, now my wife knows about my girlfriend. Does she deserve better than I've been giving her? Sure she does. I'm out here whoring around, drinking, bumming around. I'm doing the things I shouldn't be doing. And she deserves better, and Brown's a decent guy, and he thinks she's a neat lady, and so they get a relationship going. And I'm mad about that. Who set it up? If I'd been a responsible husband, if I'd been a responsible employee, would this be going on? No, not at all. So I set the stage for it. And Brown's going to get my job at the office? Sure he is. I'm about to get fired for drinking and stealing. He's an honest man. He's going to get my job. But I'm mad at those 3 people because they're not doing what I want them to. They're doing me wrong, aren't they? No, they're not doing me wrong. They are taking care of themselves, and they're doing what they're doing because what I forced on them. I am responsible for that mess. We can go on down the whole list. There are a few where that doesn't apply. There are a few where we're truly victims. But if we look at this thing, we get into it real deep. We're going to recognize that sometime in our teenage years, we told our parents to go to hell, I'm going to do what I want to do. And from that point on, we made decisions that created all the problems we have today. Sound right? Think back to when we started making our decisions, regardless of what our seniors said was the best thing to do. Almost every problem I had from that time, I was 14 or 15, up to tonight where I decided to try another way of getting out here, it was a mistake. I still make mistakes, a lot of them. I still throw away a pencil because the eraser's gone before I run out of lead. They haven't got this thing right. But as we go back, we're going to see those people responded to what it was we did to them. And we put ourselves in their position and them in our position, and we say, well, I'll be darned, I'd do exactly the same thing. I probably would have been much more nasty about it. I probably would have done it a lot sooner and a lot more in a harmful way. So now we're beginning to see the truth. But he goes ahead and he said, though a situation has not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them, we placed them before us in black and white. Here's a real neat promise that most people miss. I did for a long time. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. Where are we going to want willingness to set the matter straight? Was step 8 requirements. We made a list of all persons we'd harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And if we do the 4th step of the big book, we'll get the willingness we need to start making our amends in step 9, and we don't even know we're going to have to make them. But let's go back up to the top of the page. There's one or more prayer for each and every step, isn't there? We're getting a prayer for resentment. Now, I know a lot of folks know what's back on page 552 in the 3rd edition, but it's not in the 2nd edition, it wasn't in the 1st edition. What I'm going to refer to here is in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th edition. 3 lines down from the top is a prayer we're given for resentment. We ask God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. Who? The people that piss us off, the people that make us angry, the people that upset us. What's the prayer? When a person offended, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry. Thy will be done. Now, if we want to pray for them too, that's neat, but right now we're praying for ourselves. Who's the one that needs to be different? Me or them? Maybe they do, but that's none of my business. I've got to be different. And I'm the one that needs the help. And so when I get involved with that kind of thing, this is the prayer I use, and it works. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go with our fear. Down to the bottom of the page. Some of you were around, I remember, when Joe and Charlie were here. And I have, for a period of time, almost wallpapered the city of Dallas with some forms that you probably are familiar with. And this is what I use as we get into doing step 4. Anybody recognize these? Some of you do, I know. This is what Joe and Charlie came up with as the worksheet for step 4, and it comes right directly out of the big book, and no ideas, no opinions, not 20-some pages. One page for the resentments. And here he says, right, I start off over here, column 1, I'm resentful at. Up here it says, right out of the big book. In dealing with resentments, we set them down on paper. We listed people, institutions, and principles with whom we were angry. And this thing works so easy. It saves so much time, and it helps the kids get this thing going right away. Because over here's where I'm mad at, here's why, and then here are all the instincts brought to that. The social, material, the sex, the ambitions, my hopes and dreams, and then column 4. Where was I selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and pride? This is what I'm looking for. These are the character defects. This is why I go back and drink, is because of the way I think and the way I feel. So we use these. Right in keeping with the direction in the big book. Next thing we do is we're going to do exactly the same thing with our fears. We're going to list everybody and everything we're afraid of, and then we're going to list why they are. And then we're going to go through exactly the same process of how it affected our social, our security, and our sex instincts, how it affected our hopes and dreams, and where have we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened. One more time. And Bill over here gives us a prayer for fear. About 10 lines from the bottom of page 68. It says we ask him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be. The promise is that once we commence to outgrow fear. I forgot to tell you what the promise is of the resentment prayer. Back on page 67, the second paragraph, last sentence says, God will show us how to take a kindly and tolerant view of each and every one. And there's the promise of the fourth-step resentment prayer. Next thing we're going to do is look at our sex. One other promise, though, it comes along with the fear inventory. It's right in the middle of page 68, and I've seen this. It said, just to the extent that we would do as we think he would have us and humbly rely upon him, does he enable us to match calamity with serenity. I've seen that in a number of people. Some of you may remember Mo Johnson died of lung cancer. Joe went out with a smile on his face. Anybody remember Joe Fleisch over at Town North? Died of throat cancer. Anybody remember Paul Temple? He was my second sponsor. Died of colon cancer. We were joking at the hospital the day before he died. He just had a wonderful sense of humor. He knew he was going. He knew he wouldn't leave the hospital. Anybody remember Keith Reed? Keith was the most loving man I've ever known in my life. Horrible case of thrombosis, had a stroke, and I got to go over and see him 2 or 3 times a week in the last 6 months of his life. Every time I went over there, he'd get his vengeance out on his wife, take it out on me, and then we'd get settled down and he'd ask about somebody in the group. How's so-and-so doing? And I'd see that transformation in his eyes. And just before I'd leave, he'd grab a hold of my hand. He was totally paralyzed except for his right arm, and his head and mouth worked too damn well sometimes. But he'd grab my hand and he'd say, Cliff, in spite of it all, there was nobody on earth I'd rather be than me today. He laid that way for 6 months. I've seen this in action. I've seen it happen to the people in our fellowship who live this program. It's a promise that I have known to come true, and am I ready for it? I don't know. I'm not going to look forward to it at all because I'm enjoying life too much, but when the time comes, I hope that I've got what they have. I do hope. But we got one more thing, this sex thing, and over in the middle of page 69 it tells us exactly what we do about sex. You say we can't talk about sex in meetings. I don't know why not. Seems to be normally more than one of us involved in this sex thing. But it says, when we reviewed our own conduct over years past, where had we been selfish, dishonest, inconsiderate, whom had we hurt, where had we unjustifiably aroused jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Unjustifiably. Well, that gets to be pretty simple. I know that back when I was a kid, boys weren't too bad about it. You gals seem to have a grip on this recognition of the power you held over the male suspicion. I think the big book talks about it. It said if you little gals kind of picked up on this, you said if you decide you want what I got and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you're going to have to take certain steps. And some of these you may buck. You may think you can find an easier, softer way, but we would not. And we're going to make 58 years next month, God willing. Gets us in a lot of trouble, doesn't it? How about this unjustifiable, where am I? Lost my mind again. Jealousy. Yeah. Anybody ever play that game? Don't shake your head in here and embarrass yourself in front of everybody. We all have. We know that. She ain't doing what I want to, and so I am going to do a little bit of flirting. I'm going to try to make her jealous, and then she's going to give in, right? That didn't do it. So I'm going to tell her, I'm going to be over here tonight, and I know she's going to check, and I ain't going to be there. Now she's going to become suspicious. That'll do it. Didn't do it. What's the next step? What's the next step? Bitterness. How do we bring that on? Go find somebody in a bar and not show up till the next day at noon. That'll do it, won't it? We have had the habit of using our sex power to try to get what we want. And going through that, we begin to recognize that we have been very selfish, very dishonest, very self-seeking, very frightened, and very inconsiderate. Anytime we have an affair, and we're no worse at it than anybody else, our president has proved that to us already. Oh, we got a house full of Democrats. I'm sorry. But isn't it true? Our society has gotten pretty loose in this thing called morals. But this is one of the things that we've got to be careful of. We've got to be mindful of. That we've got to learn how to be honest and truthful. And you know, Bill said we're going to launch out on a course of vigorous action. I looked around the room. I don't sense that we've got too many Sullivans in these two rooms here tonight. Tell me the truth. When did you learn about sex? When you sat around and talked about it, thought about it, read about it, or when you had sex? Until you had actually experienced what sex was about, you didn't know a thing about it, did you? And once you had it, holy mackerel, look what I've been missing. Exactly the same thing with our program. I don't care how long you sit around and talk about it, read the book, memorize it. You ain't going to know a thing about a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening until you have taken the action that's laid out in this book. No place in this book does it say we recover by going to meetings. It says we recover by the steps we took. And step 4 happens to be one of the very most important ones because of why? Because what we find out in step 4, what we develop in this 4-step inventory is what we're going to need in step 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. The foundation of our recovery, of our spiritual development, is totally dependent on how well, how thorough, how complete we are in step 4. And if we do a half-assed job in step 4, all the rest of it's going to crumble. We have 3 prayers that go into our sex conduct. The first one is right about 2/3 of the way down on page 69, right in the middle of the paragraph. We ask God to mold our ideals and help us to live up to them. I have a feeling we have 1 prayer for resentment, 1 for fear, but 3 for our sex conduct, and I have a feeling, and this is strictly an opinion, so don't pay any attention to it, but this is back in the 30s, and that's when I was growing up. And sex was one of those no-no topics. We could not talk about sex. Some of you older folks will remember. And I think Bill felt that this was something that he was going to have to do a little bit more spiritually than he did with the resentments and the fears. And so he gave us 3 prayers. Now, that first one I just gave you 2/3 of the way down. Let's go to the last one. 4 lines from the bottom on page 69. In meditation, we ask God what we should do about each specific matter. The right answer will come if we want it. The third prayer for our sex life is over on page 70. To sum up about sex, we earnestly pray for the right ideal for guidance in each questionable situation, for sanity, for strength to do the right thing. If sex is very troublesome, we throw ourselves harder into helping others. Where do we ever come up with the idea you got to be around a year or 2 before you can go out and work with others? The folks that wrote this book, most of them within 2 weeks were sponsoring somebody. They didn't have any meetings to go to. They never heard of. Nobody ever dreamed of 90 meetings in 90 days when this book was written. They had 1 meeting a week. And a lot of them didn't get to go to a meeting until they'd taken the steps. What has gone within our fellowship that has departed so far from what the folks did that wrote this book when we had such a very high rate of success? See, back, Bill tells us in the first 20 years, they look back to 75% of them got sober and stayed sober. Dr. Bob, Clarence Snyder, Ed Dandy, and some of those others were getting better than 90%. What happened? I've got some stuff. I give it to my kids, and I'll leave it here for anybody to care to look at it. But I've been getting the information from Houston for quite a number of years. the Houston Intergroup office puts out a report at the end of every year on how many desired chips 1 year so on sold. Now, this isn't scientific, but it's certain. How many people in here love to miss their birthdays or pick up their young lady last week came in here and picked up a 2-month chip, if I remember. We don't miss those things, do we? We have more people show up at a birthday party than any other meeting during the year, don't we? So there must be something indicative about this. But what they started out with, when Jack sent these up to me back in the 80s, I didn't pay much attention to them, but this stuff I brought up last week, this article by Bob Bacon, and the thing that I saw Clarence Snyder say, it started getting my attention, and I started noticing what's happening in so many of our groups. But in 1996, just an example, we've got them on up to 1999, but in 1996 in Houston, there are 24,000 desired chips sold. We tell people to go to 90 meetings in 9 days. Guess how many people were here to get a 90-day chip? 79%. We're gone. 79% were gone. 21% were here to pick up a 90-day chip. How many were here to pick up a 1-year chip? 91% of them are gone. 9% are here to get a 1-year chip. How about 5 years? 97% are gone. 10 years, 98. You want to know what? Old Jim Jones came up with our statistics for 1999. I've got them tied in here. Same thing. Exactly the same thing in Dallas and Houston. Same thing in Memphis. Same thing any place I've looked around the country. And if you're a reader of Box 459, you know that in June and July issue, they give us a estimate of the number of members we have. Historically, we've had a 7% growth rate up until the decade of the 90s. And we went from 7% in 1989 and 90 to a declining negative membership from 1998 to 1999. Any idea why? What do we tell a newcomer when they show up here today? Get a big book and take the steps, or don't drink and go to meetings? I think we've got to take a serious look at this, folks, because if 98% of us are not surviving alcoholism and we're the ones doing the talking in the meetings, what does a newcomer have to bet their life on? Realistically. What do we owe the newcomer? Don't we owe them the same chance that Bill gave Dr. Bob? Don't we owe them the same chance that Bill and Dr. Bob gave Bob Dotson? Bill Dotson, excuse me. How about Clarence Snyder? How about all these folks back in the early days, the first 100, and many came on after that to prove that if we do what they did, we're going to get what they got. It all starts out with step 4, and over on page 71, we find out what this thing's about. We hope you are now convinced that God can remove whatever self-will's blocked you off from Him, if you've already made a decision. Step 3, in an inventory of your grosser handicap. Step 4, you've made a beginning. Until we've done the 4th step, we've made no beginning. That being so, you swallowed and digested some big chunks of truth about yourself, which says we're going to leave a lot of little stuff laying around we're going to pick up as time goes on. And those of you who've read the big book know where that promise is, that will be revealed to us. Back on page 164. God will constantly reveal more to you and to us. And He does. What's the next step? I've got my 4th step done. I'll go over to page 75. Page 75 has got 3 paragraphs. The first one tells me when I am to take a 5th step. When we decide to hear our story, we waste no time. A sponsor's going to hear it, and so we get it on. How do I take it? First sentence of the next paragraph. We pocket our pride, go to eliminating every twist of character, every dark cranny of the past. What are the promises? Here are the promises of step 5. I didn't even know there were any promises except on page 83 and 84. Today I know we've got a lot of promises sprinkled through this book. They're here, and they become real in our lives as we take the action that these folks took. But what's the first one? Once we've taken a step withholding nothing, we're delighted, are we? I certainly was. We look the world in the eye. I notice when I'm doing the 5th step with somebody, when they're beginning to lay this out with me, they're normally looking at their paper, they're looking at the floor, they're looking at the wall. And we're not very far into this thing. Of course, I do a little fifth step right back with them. I want to let them know that I was a little bit worse than they were, so ease up and feel okay. We do some sharing. But it isn't very far into it where they're looking me eyeball to eyeball. And I see it begin to work. What's the next one? We can be alone at perfect peace and ease. That horrible loneliness that's eating us up is going. Our fears fall from us. Our fears fall from us. We may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but now we begin to have a spiritual experience. Here's where we find out what this thing's about, and it's also a trap. The sad part of step 5 is if we do it the way we're supposed to, and this spiritual event begins to take place. Far too many of us believe we got it made, we don't need to do any more. I feel so much better. Man, I got it done. Somebody asked old Chuck Chamberlain how many people he did that did their fifth step with him went ahead with the rest of the program, and he said maybe 1 out of 4, maybe 1 out of 5, and I believe that's true. If we got some idea that once we get the 4th and 5th step done, we're home. We've only identified why it is we're here. In the 5th step, we have only identified clearly what's wrong with us. The way we think and the way we feel is what returns us to the bottle. That's what produces these resentments and these fears and this guilt and this loneliness and this self-pity. The things that we've got to drown with the bottle. The things that produce that restless, irritable, and discontented feeling. But he goes ahead and he says we got something we got to do before we can go on to step 6. The last paragraph says, returning home, we find a place where we can be quiet for an hour. How precise are we? 60 whole minutes. And the very first thing we do, he says, we thank God from the bottom of our heart. There are 2 prayers that go into this paragraph. And there's the first one. And then we take this book down from the shelf, we go back to page 59, and we go over the first 5 steps. Carefully reading the first 5 proposals, we ask if we have omitted anything. Who are you going to ask? It's you and the big book and God in that room, isn't it? And there's the second prayer. We ask if we have omitted anything because we're about to experience freedom. God, what a deal. I've been a slave to myself. I've been a slave to the bottle. I have been a slave to things that were destroying me. And all of a sudden I'm free. It's a heck of a price that we pay to get that thing, but once we get it, we got it. And then we go on over. I finish the 5th step. I finish my hour. I go to step 6. And step 6 is a booger. A small paragraph. It says if we can answer to our satisfaction, we then look at step 6. We have emphasized willingness as being indispensable. Bill told us back on page 12, complete willingness. Complete willingness. I had it, but I didn't know what to do with it because I didn't have somebody that directed me until I got hooked up with Joe. Step 6 is where we tell God we're willing to find out what these suckers did because now we understand what's wrong with us. Drinking wasn't my problem. My thinking was my problem. My thinking is what produced the emotions that I had to drink over. My thinking is what made me restless, irritable, and discontented. That's what I learned through step 5. Step 1 is the problem. I had the flu. I feel horrible. I can't do anything about it. It's got me under control. Step 2 is an idea. Maybe if I get to my doctor, he's going to make me feel better. Step 3 is I make a decision to go see him. Step 4, I get out there. He does an examination, draws blood, does all the things he's going to do. Step 5, he starts asking some questions to confirm what he believes he's found in these tests. And when he gets through step 5, he asks those questions like, do you drink? A little bit. He sits down and says, here's what's wrong with you. Here is exactly what your problem is. Now, if you want to recover, here's what you're going to have to do. And that's exactly what step 6 is. Step 6 is laying out the program, the treatment program that we must follow if we're going to survive alcoholism. We haven't started recovery yet. We've only identified what the problem is up here. I've got to have a complete change in the way I think and the way I feel. And if I haven't been willing to do this, the last sentence in that first paragraph says, if we still cling to something, we will not let go. We ask God to help us be willing. There is the 6-step prayer. Those of you who looked at step 6 in the big book know what the first sentence says. This is the step that separates a man from the boys. Sam Shoemaker looked at step 6 and he said, this is really a real difficult step. You're going to have to decide you want to be like your maker. And if we do the rest of the steps, we begin to approach him more and more and more. Step 6 is simply a commitment. I am going to read the rest of this book. I'm going to do what it says. I'm going to do what they did because they recovered. For 61 years, we've been able to test this thing, and nobody's been able to find anything better. Alcoholism hadn't changed. God hadn't changed. Nobody's got a better program of action. And you have to look at all the stuff we bring into our meetings that has nothing to do with what's in the cover of this book. Step 6 is, God, I'm going to do it. I promise I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow the program that you've got for me. Now, step 7 is simply saying, okay, God, as my position, you start making me different. You start changing the way I think and the way I feel, because I'm going to do steps 8 and 9 and 10, 11, and I'm going to live in 12. I'm going to do it. And once we've done that, then we finish it up. When ready, we say something like this. My Creator, I'm now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. Didn't learn that in Sunday school. But I learned in Sunday school I can give him the good, and I got to keep the bad till I figure out what to do about it. And you little girls kept me in trouble for a long time. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character that stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go after him here to do your bidding. Amen. The prayer we start on page 63, we complete on page 76. The third step and the 7-step prayer are a single prayer separated by 2 pieces of action and a commitment. Too simple, isn't it? And when we get there, what happens? Now we're ready to get on with it. I don't know if I told you all they love you today. I didn't have a chance to really tell Stephanie good when I got here tonight. And I will take the toll road next week, and my wife said she might come with me, and next week, next Wednesday night's going to be sort of an anniversary. 61 years ago, next Wednesday night, I will have had my first experience with alcohol. Isn't that amazing? I can remember my first drink and my first little girl, but I can't remember anything else the first of. The 2 most important things in my life. At this point in my life, I've given up both. Anyway, I'll